We're Inspired in Higher Ed, the podcast where we explore the inspirations driving innovation and research at UCCS.
From groundbreaking discoveries to curious passions, our guests reveal the journey that led them to their academic interests.
So tune in and join us, Dr. Blackburn
and Dr. Grant Clayton,
on a journey of academic discovery.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I was, I was born in Kentucky and I grew up a lot of my life in Texas. And so after getting a PhD, my first job was in Northern California.
Our guest for this episode is Jon Caudill, professor in criminal justice and the editor for the Youth Violence and Juvenile Justice Journal. He's sharing how he came to UCCS after living and working in California.
We were firing on all cylinders out there and having a good time and making things work, but that was always, in the back of the brain. And so there was a job opening here at UCCS, and it was to be the director of the graduate program in criminal justice. And I saw that, and I thought, man, growing up in Texas, we used to go to Colorado for vacations. Everybody wanted to go to Colorado, and we wanted to live there, and this was our opportunity to live in vacation land. So I took that to my wife, and I said, Jana, what do you think? And she's like, heck yeah, let's check it out. And so here we are today.
So talk to us about some current projects and what you're excited on, what you're working on now.
Well, I'm wrapping up a book manuscript, and it's about the unintended consequences of sentencing reform. And that kind of there's a thread that runs through this too. This project also of running counter to the culture or counter to the norms in the science. And so at the end of the day, what we suggest is that well-intentioned reforms don't always produce only positive results, and so the unintended consequences. And so this book, though, is about sentencing reform in California, and really the sentencing reform was designed to depopulate the prisons. They were under court order. The Supreme Court said you have to do this. There's no we ruled with the plaintiff on this, and you got to reduce the prison population to 137.5% of maximum capacity. Now, for the scientists out there, there's no such thing as anything over 100%, right? So it was interesting. It was very legalistic, and so for the layperson, on average, a person that commits a felony is eligible for prison, and a person that commits a misdemeanor is eligible for incarceration in the county jail for up to 1 year. With the legislation, the change, it made people that were convicted of a felony and sentenced for multiple year sentences, they had to serve their time in the county jail. Now, if you think about a prison as being a mini city, right? It has all these different offices and jobs, and people go to the chow hall to start cooking at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then somebody's over here washing linens, and there's industries, and in some states they have farms and all this other stuff, and there's all these things to do, and even though it's overpopulated, there's still space, right, to move around. Jails are not that way. Jails are meant to house people for short periods of time, and there's not a lot of opportunity for programming. And so if you think about taking somebody that has a drug addiction issue and taking them out of a prison that has programs designed for that, and then putting them in a jail that doesn't have any space for programming. In fact, in one county jail, they were using the storage closet. They'd cleaned out all the riot gear and stuff and turned that into a counseling room for group counseling. But that was the only storage room they had, right? So it's not like they could replicate this, right? And so while well-intentioned, it didn't play out the way that I think most people thought it would.
When I was in undergrad, as part of this volunteer writing program, when we went into, this was up north in Colorado, the Larimer County Jail. And yet, as you were kind of describing the lack of enrichment and the hopelessness, that's definitely something that's really stuck with me from that experience, because it really did feel like everyone there was really craving just more enrichment interaction programming. They truly needed it, and they didn't have the space. They'd come into our small writing program. We could only have 20 people in the program at once, and a lot of the stuff they wrote, clearly they needed more professional kind of therapy help, way more than an undergrad it's like assigned to just kind of help them make their writing better, could handle, and
Right.
and we didn't have anybody to really connect them with, turn them over to. This was basically their only outlet, letting a 19-year-old read their poetry that was very, many of it very dark, really heavy, just like getting into a lot of stuff. And so it definitely, as what you were describing, really fits with what I actually experienced going into those spaces of, for a lot of people, not a good fit to actually want to help, like, reform, help them find success, like help them kind of turn things around, make changes. It really is kind of sit and stew in your mistakes and we'll just leave you there forever is kind of the sense I walked away with. It was intense.
Professor Caudill observed additional effects such as an increased workload for the district attorney's office, the court system at large, and probation officers as offenses were transferred to misdemeanors, among a lot of other factors, of course. But one really interesting, at least for me, aspect that he speaks about next is how the life inside of the jail changed.
I just happened to be working with a sheriff out there at the time and had an office in his office, and I was able to access the jail on a pretty regular basis and talk to people that had been in and out of jail and talk to officers that worked in and out of jail, and they said it was just different. And so I started digging into this, and sure enough, we started noticing that it was a population shift. The population stayed the same because they were kicking out people that were lower level offenders, the habitual drunkard that they arrest and help sober up. They were kicking those people out, and they were having to hold these people these more sophisticated offenders for longer periods of time. And so you had people, instead of it being a very transitory environment, which historically that's the way jails have been in the United States, it now becomes their home. And so we saw an increase in violence, staff assaults associated with this prison reform in the jails, and then we started to see a culture shift in the prison politics that these inmates would use in the prison system to protect the hustle, the drug trade, cell phone trade, whatever it is. They were starting to rear their ugly heads. These concepts were in the jail. And so we were able to identify some culture shifts and look at the way jails have been described in the past by authors, and then compare that to what we were seeing after the sentencing reform. And so that was a pretty interesting piece. But this book, has manuscript has grown out of that, and we're about 80% done with it. So I'm hoping to have this out to somebody. I'm actually shopping through publishers right now.
Jon's bio is linked in our show notes so you can read more of his work and keep an eye out for that book publication. Now, we're going to jump into our discussion of an article that impacted Professor Caudill and inspired him to look deeper into criminal justice theories, reform, and approaches. The article is titled Broken Windows: The Police and Neighborhood Safety, written by James Q. Wilson and George L. Kelling. It was published in The Atlantic, yes, that news, politics, culture magazine, back in 1982. That source is linked in the show notes.
This work that you shared with us on broken windows and how it fits with your work, and walk us through it a little bit and how we should be thinking about broken windows, and especially since I read it and what it felt like is everything that's old is new again.
Yeah.
Because a lot of these things we're readdressing or still trying to address.
Yeah, I got to tell you, it was kind of a hard decision on picking an article. I don't like being put on the spot on selecting just one. So I almost sent you 10, but then I thought, well, that would make for a really long discussion. So no, and I think this is fluid, right? And so this doesn't mean that Wilson and Kelling's Broken Windows is the albeit for me, right? I mean, it depends on where I'm at. And I think with the conversation about scientific censorship and things like that, this is one that I was like, this is, and this is one of my top articles for a few reasons. It ran counter to the majority opinion in criminal justice and criminology science. And I think part of the reason for that was it was misunderstood. If you look in any criminology textbook today, for example, it lists broken windows as a theory of criminology, the etiology of crime, why people commit crime. But Wilson and Kelling's Broken Windows, it did explore those ideas, but really relied on some social psychology literature out there that identified these things and had the findings. So they just brought those. It was almost like the literature review to build up to where they were at.
This often misunderstood idea of broken windows stems from a literal observation and experiment and extends to the more hypothetical, theoretical state of a neighborhood. In the literal sense of what we're talking about today, when a window, a building, or perhaps a car is broken and left unrepaired, it sends a signal in that area that no one is really maintaining the property and there is less overall social order. These behaviors and perceptions were studied by social psychologists with a link to that work in the show notes for you. Now, the literal idea of broken windows in a neighborhood turns into this theory of order maintenance, community care, social control, and policing tactics that influences behaviors and crime.
And Wilson and Kelling's work was based on Kelling's observations of police officers on foot patrol in Newark, right? And so it wasn't about why people commit crime. They were establishing through the literature that why people commit crime, and then saying this is how the police react to protect this, right? To enhance this informal social control. They do order maintenance to keep the scary people off the street, so the grandmothers will come out of their house. I mean, that's the example they use. They'll come out of their house and engage with people to make sure the order maintenance is informal social control, not this formal social control. So the idea is that if police do their job and suppress some of the order maintenance stuff, the communities can come together, right? And so it's really a focus on policing. But like I said, it was interpreted as a theory to explain crime, and it was really hard to measure some of these things. And that a lot of the criticism came out of this idea of how do you measure crime versus disorder. Well, that was just a statement they made based on some of this other research. And so so I actually, in looking at this, I saw it as an opportunity to test it. I was working with the Dallas Police Department as a research fellow, and I was asked to join a task force to identify metrics that they should measure that would feed into their budget. It was a metrics-based budget model in Dallas, and so every year they had to collect these data points. That's what they called them, and they would crunch the numbers and then send it over to City Hall so that City Hall could say, okay, you're doing your job. Well, what were they using? What were they measuring? Right. Well, response time was one of those things that everybody's really interested in when it comes to police. Although I'm going to spoiler alert, it doesn't really reduce crime in the way it's measured. Like in the variants we have now, if it took them 10 days to get to your robbery call, then it would maybe be different. But if it's somewhere between 2 minutes and 14 minutes, the odds of solving that crime and reducing actually crime in the neighborhood, it's not there. All right. So, but these are the things that people are interested in. They're political too, right? And so, so we measured that. We measured, the number of officers on a beat. That was something that they talked about, how many officers they could show were working in an area. So we measured that, and so there was a few other things in there that they weren't measuring. And one of those things was kind of this order maintenance stuff. And so, looking at whether, so if you think about how this plays out, officers when they're out on patrol. They don't write a lot of pedestrian tickets. Usually the pedestrian tickets they write are because it's just a flagrant disregard for the law. People are all walking up and down the street, right in the middle of the street, right? And so I thought, well, this is an interesting order maintenance issue, right? It's a ticket, right? It's a civil thing, really. But then we can measure reported crime, felony crime in those areas. And so that became kind of the idea here. So the main focus was on the on pedestrian tickets, citations, and how that related to property crime and violent crime, looking at it through a broken windows model. And what we found was that and so pedestrian citations is really a measure of officer activity, right? Are you getting out of your car to stop somebody that's a pedestrian and talk to them, whatever? And so what we found was after controlling for the number of officers in an area, some of these other factors, we found that these pedestrian citations actually reduced property crime in those areas. And we did a lagged effect because it was over time series analysis, and looked at the lagged effect to make sure that it was it lasted for like 3 months. And so the idea that what officers do matters when they're out there kind of came through in there. And so the research that we did with Dallas PD supported at least partially this idea of order maintenance and property crime. Now, I think there's more to be said about the order maintenance, property crime, violent crime relationship. But I got distracted with some other research and haven't had a chance to circle back to do that.
So as we're thinking through order, I got to thinking about order and the role of policing, because I felt like a lot of it, this historical run through it is, hey, police used to do this and then these changed, and order maintenance, as you talked about it, and that's probably the better term. Here the police trying to keep order versus actually engaging in crime, and how we should think about order and chaos, especially since I think about Denver and Colorado Springs, where both mayors ran on really what seems like order maintenance to me. One of the big things they're talking about was we're going to go address homelessness. Mm-hmm. And it's not so much that homelessness was the big problem, but it's got this disorder piece to it, and how those types of things fit in order maintenance and in orderly society versus actually addressing crime.
I would say officers spend more time dealing with things that aren't a situation where they arrest somebody than they do and actually spending time. Street officers, detectives obviously are going to go out and investigate specific crimes, but the officers that you see every day out of the patrol car, there's a lot of things they do that aren't really, you could argue, are not within the specific mission of the criminal justice system. Order maintenance is part of that, right? Helping people when they break down on the side of the car, on the side of the road, right? Controlling traffic, right? If you're out directing traffic, that's completely an order maintenance thing, right? Should we just pop them out of there and see what happens, right? And it's pretty clear that the role of order maintenance is heavy in policing in America. Yeah. Now, I'll tell you, it's not always taken the way you would think it is, right? I mean, it's well, clearly, I mean, there's a national narrative right now of the idea is to defund the police, right? Well, if you defund them, they're not going to do those order maintenance things, right? And so, what does that look like? I don't know. But this idea of order maintenance is not particularly popular at the moment. It may be in the near future, depending on how things play out. But as an example, I was having lunch with a judge not too long ago, and we were just talking about things, and I said something about this work that we did in testing broken windows and this idea of order and maintenance policing, and it was effective. And we were talking about crime in the community and stuff, and the response was, well, the courts found that that's illegal. You can't stop and frisk people, and I just kind of let the I went on to something else, because it was clear to me that they didn't understand stop and frisk and broken windows are different things. And actually, the stop and frisk is a very invasive idea. You could argue that order maintenance may be invasive, right? But I think the image of the stop and frisk sucks some of the positive things out of order maintenance policing and makes it all look bad. And listen, if you're just stopping people that are walking down the street for no good reason and frisking them, yeah, that's not what we're looking for. That doesn't create good relationships. It's not really order maintenance, right? It's harassment, at least. But broken windows doesn't argue for that. Yeah. It's actually more of a community policing model that has the order maintenance in there.
Yeah. One of the things that I really appreciated a lot about the broken windows kind of model is that kind of the rules of order and what constituted order, I felt like really came from the community and much more in collaboration of, okay, in this specific neighborhood, which is why it was important to have that nice consistent beat officer assigned to actually understand the rules of that specific neighborhood community and help enforce the order kind of coming more from the people, from the residents. Whereas, I think the policies like stop and frisk, it's a very external, these are the rules of order and the type of people and the type of activities we want to enforce, without as much of that actual sort of collaborative co-participation from the people. And so I really appreciated that idea of, if we want to really make our communities feel safer, which will then, lead to, in extent, be safer, engaging with the actual people that live there and sort of what order means to them, felt critical and maybe overlooked in a lot of other conversations.
Yeah, I mean, the culture of the community really matters.
So stop me if I got this wrong, but I got to thinking about order maintenance, and then later they start talking about community policing and getting out of cars and interacting with people, and they had that nice vignette talking about interacting with teenagers. versus through your window versus being on the street, and it struck me the idea of order being the feel being it's an externally imposed thing versus it's ground up, and this is order for our community and order for what we want, and how that seems to be the tension that we're seeing now in policing. And so I guess the first question is, did I kind of get that right? And second, then how do we start thinking about this tension of, is it an externally imposed order, or is it a kind of ground up or an internally imposed order?
Yeah, the idea of organic order based on culture, I think, is, that's that's the gold standard, right? I mean, that's what we want it to look. That's what we want it to feel, right? Because it makes it a lot easier to police a community if the community values the things you're trying to stop from happening, right? And so if everybody buys this idea of collective efficacy, everybody agrees with the rules and everybody's willing to act in accordance to follow those rules. I think there's some limitations to that too. And, one of the things that we have to think about is that, why did we move away from that model? Or why do we move away from this idea of police being, why are we questioning the police today, I guess? And I think sometimes when we think about a community, we think about a singular voice. And I suspect, and if you look at different communities with different characteristics, you have different levels of collective efficacy, meaning that in certain communities, 90% of the people may be on board with this idea, right, and advocate for it. In other communities, it may be more split. And so it may be harder in those communities to gain a sense of everybody's opinion about what order maintenance looks like versus the loud voices, because there's less collective efficacy, I guess.
Short answer, I've got the plot right, but it's complicated. So trying to tie kind of the beginning of our conversation with broken windows. You were talking about sentence reform and a lot of unintended consequences. And then you had, obviously, your example with the judge where stop and frisk now got unintentionally linked to broken windows. How much of this was really misunderstood and misapplied and unintended consequences and not actually what they were talking about at all?
Yeah, I think, the idea that if you look at any intro to criminology textbook, it's listed as a theory to explain crime, that's consequential, right? The idea that people tested it as that kind of a theory and didn't find support for it, so therefore dismissed it, is consequential, because there is some research out there, at least, that says that there may, empirically supports this theory, right? It's tested, and so, so we throw the baby out with the bathwater on this thing because we don't like it, because we interpreted it to be a theory of crime instead of a theory of policing strategy. I will tell you that in the practitioner world, it's well known, right? And in law enforcement circles, it makes a lot of sense. It resonates with people. And so much to the point that large cities look for ways to incorporate foot patrol beats. And, I've never lived in Newark. I don't know if you all have, but I can imagine what it looks like. We're talking very vertical spaces, right, instead of spread out spaces. And so a walking beat makes a lot of sense in a place like that, because you're going to have to get out of your car and go up, 20 stories anyhow, right? And then maybe come down and walk 10 feet and then go up another building. And so it makes a lot of sense there. But when you're trying to do a walking beat in the outskirts of Dallas, you're going to have some really fit officers, right? And they're not going to engage in a lot of people. And so, so they've tried to do other things like bicycles, right? And segways. They, some of these cities in the downtown area, they do the segways. And, I don't know that actually solves the problem of the door and the car, because if you're on a Segway, you're going a lot faster than I am, and you're way taller than I am. And on a bicycle, it's different too. But these are complications that come from. It's not a one size fits all, I guess, is the idea of a walking beat. But the idea of what officers do out there matters. And so if we're going to get rid of this as a theory, then what theory are you going to look at to estimate, to really get an idea of whether it matters what officers do out there? If we put an officer on every street and they just stood there, would it be effective? It'd be expensive.
We have been recording for quite a while. Want to make sure you also get to your next engagement in time. So last two questions, kind of focusing a little bit more, bringing it back to, our campus, our listeners. What maybe additional advice or any advice do you have for researchers on campus? And what's your favorite thing about UCCS?
I think you got to balance your time, right? And that's echoed all over the place, right? Everybody says that, right? Um, but we all tend to give in to the demands of service and teaching, right? Because we want to be good teachers, and we appreciate our colleagues' time, and our students hold us accountable in instruction, right? And our colleagues hold us accountable through the service aspects of it. Who holds us accountable for the research component of it? Listen, I'm not very smart, so it takes me a long time to think about things. I'm serious. Like I have to be very deliberate, and I need space to think about things, to think them through, right? And it's really hard to do that when you're jumping on an email, back and forth emails, because you get distracted, whether you recognize that there's an emotional response, right? Your brain starts thinking about something else, and then you lost where you're at. Or you put down a paper for a week, and then you got to spend an hour trying to figure out where you're at in your thought process before you start writing again. And so I would encourage folks to protect their time in a way that makes sense to them, so they can hold themselves accountable. So protect your time and know what your expectations are. Yeah.
Everything about UCCS.
We love the community here in Colorado Springs and in El Paso County. Our family has everyone in our family has really great friend networks, and it's really powerful. And I think that makes life great, right? I'm a professor in my career, right? But I have all these other hats that I wear too, right? I'm a dad, and I volunteer at the schools, and I do all these other things, and so having that community feel off campus is really powerful, right? And so I really like that. And speaking of UCCS, though, I really like the community we have here, uh, the culture that we have, this protecting the pride, the lion pride idea. I think that really resonates with me, and we have a reputation at UCCS. I think we value of being hard workers and putting a lot of hats on and just getting the job done and being kind of scrappy, and that kind of aligns with a lion pride to me. I mean, you got to be some kind of scrappy sometimes, and I really like that. I will say that one of the things that I think I always try to share this with my students. You know, look for opportunities to pay it forward. Even if it's just reaching out, if you just recently graduated and looking to pay it forward, congratulate somebody else that's graduating, right? Reach out to somebody new, email, say, hey, congratulations. What are you up to, right? Keep those contacts, because that's how you get the opportunity to pay it forward, and I think that's important.
That was great advice, and what a way to end this episode. It was a really amazing conversation that unfortunately we had to cut a lot out of, but was definitely inspiring, thought provoking, and insightful. And if you have a piece of advice or favorite thing about your campus that gets you excited and inspired, do let us know at in_higher_ed on Instagram. Also, you can drop a comment if you're listening on YouTube or ask a question right in the Spotify app. Check out the show notes for our citations and more information about Dr. Jon Caudill. Thank you so much for listening and getting inspired in higher ed. And reach out if you have a story you want to share.
Normally I print that stuff out.
Yeah, I'd rather you have specific questions than shoot from the hip.
I got follow-up questions.
I feel better about it already.